Hey historians, welcome to Decoding the Test and a quick look at the Gilded Age. Now as always, this is not everything I would want you to know about this time period. This is just an analysis of where the test has focused its attentions in the past. Now if you're aiming for that higher level score, I would know all the details that you see in front of you. But if you want to look at where the test is focused, for the Gilded Age it boils down to four areas: immigration, American power, industry, and corruption. Well, today we're going to look at industry and industrialization. Now, with this, it's a bit of a grab bag on what details the test will mention. However, I can give you some takeaways. The first is that if it's a positive mention, it's going to be about farming and ranching and the positive impacts of Western settlement. This is kind of a surprising addition to the test. Usually when you're looking at the Gilded Age and industrialization, you're focusing on factories and working conditions. Surprisingly, the test focuses more on farming and ranching and Western settlement. Very odd, but it's come up enough that I can point out, hey, you're going to need to know this. Also, you're going to get an overall view of industrialization, and that's where you're going to get the negatives. If it mentions industrialization, you're going to be looking at one of the negative impacts of industrialization. Now that can be many things. That could be child labor, long working conditions. It could be trusts. It could be the need for the formation of labor unions. But I can tell you, you're going to get that kind of negative viewpoint. So let's look at some examples. What you see here, this is one of those, again, surprising questions. It is what contributed to increased settlement of the Great Plains. Now this is referring to the Homestead Act and things of that nature that the government passed to basically make it easier to get land in the West, to encourage people to move west. This is way back in U.S. history. This is, pretty much page 1 for high school U.S. history. The answer is a series of federal land grants. The idea that the government is basically paying for a little bit to a lot of the land that Western settlers would purchase and stake their claim on. This is a question about railroad transportation and how did it benefit farmers? And again, this is that surprising focus on farming and ranching and settlement rather than, say, the industrial conditions in factories. So how did the expansion of railroad transportation benefit farmers? Well, the more railroads they are, the more farmers can get their product out to distant areas. Farmers can make more money. If you look at C, by providing farmers with affordable access to distant markets. That is how railroads really benefited farmers. You might get a similar question on cattlemen and ranching. How did railroads affect ranching? Same answer. It made getting the beef from the ranch to distant areas much easier, and it made it much more profitable. Speaking of, which outcome best completes this diagram? Increased population growth causes an increased demand for higher crop yields. Causes what? Now you're sitting there going, I don't know much about farming. What is a higher crop yield? Sometimes it's best to just focus on the adjective. You might not know what a crop yield is, but higher means more. More crops. Okay. More people led to more crops led to what? If you look at this, the answer is B, the conversion of natural habitat to farmland. There's more need for farmland. That makes sense. But you might have been kind of lost looking at a question like this, like what's going on? Just keep this in mind. If you get a farming and ranching question, then it is a Gilded Age question. What is the overall focus? In the Gilded Age, farming and ranching increases. Keep that in mind. And finally, here's a question that's directly on cattle. You get a lot of descriptions, and then, how do you best complete this list? If you look down to the very bottom, the need to process large amounts of cattle made meat packing a major industry. This is something that I've only seen a couple of times, but it connects the increase in cattle to the increase in industrialization, meat packing. Now, the second focus is on the overall negatives of industrialization. Which of the following occurred between 1865 and 1900 as a result of industrialization? This is a very generalized question. You're looking for a negative answer. In this particular case, union membership increased as workers sought better pay and conditions. You've got workers in horrible conditions getting horrible pay, and they're trying to fix it. That is the answer. So labor unions, the increase in labor unions because of negative conditions. Now, if you look at some of these other things, F is not an overall negative. F, social and economic class divisions begin to disappear. Well, that's actually the opposite of what happens. We get class divisions spreading. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Concerns about air pollution led to stricter environmental regulations. Well, that's not something that's going to happen until the 1970s. So that is kind of anachronistic, so you can cross that out. Factory owners introduced wage equity policies for women in the workplace. Paying women a fair wage, again, this is really not something you're going to see until the 60s and 70s, so you can go ahead and cross that off, leaving just one. Now, this is kind of a, like I said, a grab bag area. You have to understand industrialization in the United States. That's just kind of a given. So you have to understand that industry is growing. You have to understand that profits are growing. You have to understand that in order for profits to grow and to maximize profits, business owners did not care just overly much about the conditions of their workplace, the conditions of their workers, how much they paid their workers, or whether it was right or wrong to use children. So you have horrible conditions. Those horrible conditions encouraged workers to go on strike, to join labor unions. That is a summary of the industrialization of the United States. You basically need to know that summary because you're going to get questions like this. I would like to be able to kind of pinpoint like, oh, it's always going to talk about labor unions. I can't do that. It's just a generalization. Look at this problem. Reasons for economic problems of the Gilded Age. You have the growth of monopolies, you have ruthless business tactics, you have unfair practices. How does the government respond to these problems? If you look through, it's actually the first answer, passing the Interstate Commerce Act. So you need to know how government responded in the Gilded Age. You might get the Interstate Commerce Act, you might get the Sherman Antitrust Act. They both amount to the same thing. The idea that government is going to step in and limit what businesses can do and how they can behave. Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act are the two laws you might see in reference to that. If there's no questions, comments, or screams of angst, this particular area of focus does seem broad, but you can narrow it down. The test will probably ask about farming and ranching and how it increased in the industrial age. That's weird, but it's going to ask. It's also going to ask about industrialization. It's important for you to know the negatives of industrialization. It's important for you to know how the government responded to the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. That's what you should focus on. If there's no questions, comments, or screams of angst, I will see you in the next video.